Have you ever looked at a couple and thought, wow, they are just not on the same page anymore? Now, imagine that couple is an entire generation. This isn't about a breakup in a house. This is about a fundamental political divorce happening within Generation Z, or so the called Gen Z. Right now, in countries across Europe and North America, young men and young women are looking at the exact same world, the same broken housing markets, the same anxious job landscape, and coming to two completely different political conclusions. For the first time in modern memory, gender is becoming a more powerful predictor of your political ideology than almost any other factor. Today, we're not just looking at voting charts. We're asking a deeper, more unsettling question. Why is a shared crisis driving a young man and a young woman in the same city, with the same economic fears, into completely different and often opposing political arms? And what does this mean for the future of our democracies? Before we dive deep, a quick but important note. This video is an educational and analytical discussion of global political trends. It is based on my interpretation of publicly available data, academic research, and reporting. This is not financial, legal, or political advice, and it absolutely does not promote violence, hate, or extremist ideologies. We're here to understand a complex shift, not to advocate for one. With that said, let's unpack what's happening. So let's lay out the puzzle pieces. The data is coming in from all over, and it's painting a stark picture. First, the baseline mood, profound strain. A major Harvard poll from late 2025 found that a staggering 57% of young Americans believe the country is on the wrong track. Only 13% feel things are headed in the right direction. Now here's where it fractures. Look at who they're turning to. In the United States, if you look at the broader Gen Z cohort, between ages 18 to 29, still lean Democratic for Congress. But dig a little deeper into that Yale youth poll, and a fascinating split appears. Voters aged 22 to 29 preferred Democrats by a decent margin. But the youngest voters, those 18 to 21, the ones who spent their high school years in the heart of the COVID-19 pandemic, actually preferred Republicans by over 11 points. The researchers themselves were surprised, suggesting the pandemic's complete societal upheaval changed how that specific group views government and authority. Now, cross the Atlantic to Europe. The pattern becomes even more gendered. Research analyzing European elections found that in 2024, 21% of young men, aged 18 to 29, expressed support for far-right parties, compared to just 14% of young women. This gap is roughly double what we see in older age groups. In places like Germany, the populist far-right Alternative for Germany, AfD, draws heavily from young men. Meanwhile, young women in Germany are more likely to support parties on the populist left. This isn't just a European story. We see similar, though culturally distinct dynamics in South Korea, and analysts note the potent appeal of a macho culture narrative to young men in the U.S. political context. A generation facing immense pressure is politically activated, but it's splitting, often along gender lines, with young men gravitating toward populist, often far-right messages, and young women moving toward the populist left. But I have to push back on the most common simplistic explanation here. It's tempting to just say, oh, young men are becoming more sexist, or young women are just more progressive. That might be a slice of the story, but it's not the whole pie. If it were that simple, we'd see this pattern everywhere, uniformly. And we don't. To understand why they're choosing different escape routes from the same burning building, we have to look at what's actually on fire. Now, before we break down those political escape routes, I want to pause for a moment on that idea of daily strain. A lot of this political energy comes from the sheer mental load of just getting by, working, studying, and trying to eat well on a tight budget and schedule. It's exhausting. And that's actually a perfect segue to talk about something I've been using lately that's helped simplify at least one part of life, and that is Mom's Meals. I'm not a sponsored channel guy by nature, but this one resonated because it directly addresses that I'm too busy and stressed to cook properly feeling. Mom's Meals delivers chef-prepared, ready-to-eat meals right to your door. What stood out to me was the range. They're not just throwing a lasagna in a box. We're talking keto-friendly meals, diabetic-friendly, low-carb, low cholesterol, halal, vegetarian meals, and so much more. For anyone with specific dietary needs or just specific health goals, that's a game changer. The meals are designed for real life, emphasizing convenience and nutrition for busy schedules. And the best part? Prices start from just $7.99 per meal. If you're feeling that daily time crunch and want to take one big task off your plate, I've put the link in the description. You can get 50% off your first order if you want to try it. It's been a genuine help for me during busy weeks. All right, let's get back to the analysis. For years, the classic explanation for populist surges was the left behind theory, impoverished industrial regions voting for change. That's still part of it. But for Gen Z, the economic insecurity is different. It's not necessarily about a factory closing, it's about the door to a stable adult life being permanently locked. In the European Union, house prices have shot up by about 60% on average since 2015. In some cities, rents have doubled or even tripled in a decade. The official EU policy site states that around 1 in 10 people in Europe now report being unable to pay their rent or mortgage on time. Think about that level of precarity. This isn't just a millennial avocado toast problem. This is a structural economic drag. A European investment bank report argues that high housing costs actively discourage mobility. Young people turn down the best university offers or the perfect job because they can't afford to live in that city. That hurts their lifetime earnings, it hurts national productivity, and it fuels a deep generational resentment. Now here's my first core analytical point. Both young men and young women experience this crisis, but they may experience the social consequences differently. For many young men, traditional masculinity has been partly tied to the provider role, the ability to get a job, own a home, and start a family. When that path seems impossible due to forces that feel distant and elite, global investors, short-term rental platforms, central bank policies, it doesn't just create financial stress. It creates an identity crisis. You're told what you should be, but the economy makes it feel unattainable. That's a potent recipe for anger and a desire to blame a system you see as rigged. For many young women, the economic crisis intersects with different social pressures. They are, on average, outpacing men in higher education attainment. Yet they face a persistent gender pay gap and often a disproportionate burden of care work. For them, the unaffordable housing market or the threat of AI to job security isn't just a failure of the economy. It can feel like an added barrier on top of existing inequalities. Their frustration may be directed at a system that demands they excel academically and professionally, but then slams a financial door in their face. So, you have one crisis: the affordability trap, hitting two groups who are socially primed to interpret that crisis through different lenses. This, I think, is the critical starting point. This brings us to the political marketplace. Where do these different flavors of frustration go shopping? This is the part of the conversation that gets uncomfortable, but we have to be honest about it. When you look closely, populist right movements have become very good at speaking directly to the identity crisis a lot of young men are feeling right now. And the pitch they make is actually pretty simple. It usually comes in two parts. First, they offer a clear scapegoat. Instead of explaining economic frustration as the result of complicated systems, global markets, broken housing policy, financialization, zoning laws, they translate all of that anxiety into a cultural fight. The story becomes, it's immigrants taking your jobs and housing, or it's detached elites who look down on you. That kind of framing gives people a clear enemy. And psychologically, it's powerful because it replaces confusion with a sense of control. Suddenly, the problem feels identifiable, even beatable. The second part is the promise of restored order, and this is crucial. These movements often push a vision of society where rules are clear, authority is respected, and those who break the rules face consequences. For someone who feels lost in a world that seems chaotic and unfair, that promise can be incredibly appealing. Strong leadership, clear hierarchy, and defined social roles offer something stability-like. It's not just about politics. It's about restoring a sense of place, structure, and status that feels like it's been slipping away. Social media, particularly the realms dominated by manfluencers promoting hypermasculine, self-discipline, and dominance ideals, acts as a superhighway for these messages. The aesthetic and the political pitch merge. On the other side, the populist left tends to frame these same economic pressures in a very different way, especially when speaking to young women. Things like unaffordable housing, student debt, and rising healthcare costs are presented not as random failures, but as the result of a system that's fundamentally broken. A system that rewards a small group at the top, oligarchs, entrenched interests, while locking in long-standing inequalities, including sexism. And the pitch here isn't about going back to some earlier version of society. It's almost the opposite. The argument is that the system itself needs to be taken apart and rebuilt. The idea is that if you dismantle what's rigged and unfair, you can create something more just, more inclusive, and more equitable going forward. For a lot of people, that framing doesn't just explain why things feel so hard right now. It offers a sense of purpose and moral clarity about what should change next. Their critique also heavily incorporates social justice, reproductive rights, and climate action, issues that polls consistently show resonate more strongly with young progressive women. The enemy isn't a cultural other, but a wealthy, powerful above. Now, let me address a major counter-argument head-on. Some might say, this is just boys will be boys. Young men have always been more rebellious and conservative. They'll grow out of it. That's a comforting thought, but the data suggests it's wrong. Academic research that tracked this trend specifically tested that life cycle theory. If it were just an age thing, we'd see similar gaps in past generations when they were young. We don't. This is a distinct generational phenomenon, most pronounced in Gen Z. The conditions shaping them, the pandemic lockdowns, the social media ecosystem, the specific economic dead ends, are unique. The voting habits formed now are more likely to stick, potentially cementing this gender divide for decades. So, we have a generation whose shared economic pain is pulling them apart politically. Why should anyone over 30 care? The implications are massive, and they go far beyond who wins the next election. First, the threat to democratic stability. Research on past populist governments, both left and right, shows a troubling pattern. They are, on average, significantly more likely to trigger democratic backsliding, eroding checks and balances, and making it harder for them to be voted out. If a large, permanent bloc of young men consolidates behind parties with authoritarian tendencies, and a large, permanent bloc of young women consolidates behind parties seeking radical systemic overhaul, the center of our politics doesn't just weaken, it vanishes. Compromise becomes biologically difficult. You're not just disagreeing on policy, you're disagreeing on fundamental reality with your own peers. The Harvard poll revealed a chilling detail. A meaningful minority of young Americans now express a conditional tolerance for political violence, driven by that cocktail of financial strain and alienation. Second, the social and cultural rift. This isn't just politics. This is about how this generation will form relationships, build communities, and raise families. If young men and women are being funneled into information ecosystems and value systems that are increasingly hostile to one another, what happens to dating, to marriage, to workplace collaboration? We risk raising the drawbridges not just between parties, but between the sexes in everyday life. Third, the global perspective is a crucial reality check. My analysis can't be complete without acknowledging this isn't a universal law. Look at the research compiled by the European Democracy Hub. In Bhutan, with its youth unemployment and cost of living issues, politics remains pragmatic and issue-based, not ideologically split. Their constitution actually bars appeals to ethnicity or religion for votes. In Zimbabwe, many young people pragmatically support the entrenched party, ZANU-PF, not out of far-right ideology, but because it controls access to jobs, land, and economic survival. In Mozambique, extremism grows not from online gender wars, but from physical violence and desperate poverty. This tells us something vital. The Western Gen Z gender split is not inevitable. It's the product of a specific intersection: advanced economic stagnation, meeting hyper-individualistic, social media-driven cultures. It's what happens when the American dream, or its European equivalent, fails for a generation that was told it was a promise. Where does this leave us? Well, I don't have a neat, happy ending. What I have is a framework for understanding what might come next. If the housing crisis deepens, if AI-driven job displacement hits harder than anticipated, the feelings of insecurity fueling this divide will intensify. The populist pitches on both sides will become louder and more attractive. We are playing with political dynamite here. This isn't about a universal basic income check. It's about the tangible foundations of adulthood, truly affordable housing, healthcare that doesn't bankrupt you, education that leads to stable work, and a sense that the future holds more promise than peril. Until that happens, parties offering simplistic, culturally charged answers will continue to harvest this generation's anxiety. The young man blaming immigration for why he can't afford an apartment, and the young woman blaming billionaire greed for the same reason, are both responding to a real wound. They're just being sold different and often mutually exclusive cures. We have to stop talking about Gen Z politics as a monolith. That's over. We are now witnessing the rise of his Gen Z and her Gen Z. Their political divorce is a symptom of a deeper economic and social fracture. Whether this becomes a lasting schism or a painful phase of realignment depends less on TikTok algorithms and more on whether our economies can be rebuilt to work for them both. The most important question for the next decade may not be left or right. It might be, can we find a common ground before the ground itself splits apart? If you found this analysis useful, don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and hit the notification bell. This is a complex, evolving story, and I'll be keeping a close eye on it. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.